The year 1895, Third Era. I was 17 years old at the time, working on the family's farm. I still remember the day, June the 37th. My 3 brothers, my only sister, and I were cleaning out the horse stables when an automotive vehicle began to drive up to my family's house. It was my first time ever seeing an automotive vehicle in my life. Then 2 men dressed in military uniform stepped out. They walked to the front door as my father and mother met them there. We all stopped working to watch the 2 men talk to our parents. We didn't hear anything, but whatever. It was obvious that my mother didn't like it. She was screaming and waving her finger in their faces. After a couple of minutes, my mother stormed off into the house, leaving my father to continue the conversation. The conversation would last for another 30 minutes. Then they left, and we continued with our chores. The rest of the day, my mother was in an agitated mood. We went the whole day wondering what they had told our parents, and at dinner, we would find out. Before we ate, our father broke his silence, telling us Bavarian had invaded our country. My father was a retired general, and he was being recalled back to military service, and my 2 brothers had to go with him as well. They left in the morning on horseback, taking only the essentials needed for the journey. A month later, a man with about 20 soldiers arrived in automotive vehicles called trucks. The man walked over to my mother, handing her a piece of paper, then told her the farm was now the property of the Frankford military, and we had 24 hours to grab our belongings, 1 wagon and 1 horse to pull the wagon. My mother was furious, waving her finger in their faces, but she would eventually back off. By the morning, we had everything packed, and we were ready to go. We stopped an hour into our journey to prepare for breakfast, trying to make the best of our situation. Another hour would go by. Then we saw it, hundreds of people traveling down the same road that we were traveling on. I stopped a couple of people, asking them what was going on, and it turns out our government was taking our farms from us to provide food supplies for the soldiers and their generals. We stayed there for 2 more hours, and when we were ready to leave, we packed back up and got into the convoy that ran for miles. Our travel lasted a week. Then we finally reached our destination, the city of Nantes. Nantes is the 3rd largest city in Frankfurt and has the largest port in the nation. As we got into the city, the streets were crowded with people, mainly soldiers loading up on troops' transport truck. We finally reached the center of the city, and my mother told me to stop the wagon as she got off and said to wait until she came back, then disappeared into the crowds of people. We sat there for a while waiting. Then about 30 minutes, a recruitment officer approached me. The first thing he asked me was, why am I not getting into the recruitment line? Before I was able to say anything, he started screaming at me, calling me a coward and a draft dodger. I tried to explain to him I was only 17 years old, but he seemed not to care as he pulled out his revolver, cocking the hammer back. We would argue for a few more minutes until a voice behind me said in a deep voice, "Holster your weapon and go about your day, Lieutenant." I looked behind me to see who was talking, and it was my aunt's husband, the Grand Admiral of the Navy. I turned back around as the man was walking away, putting his gun away. My aunt and mother was right behind my uncle, asking us if we were okay. It turns out my mother brought us to Nantes to stay with my aunt in her house in the inner city. As this war continues, it wouldn't take long before we all had to work in the city to contribute to helping the war effort. My mother and sister worked making clothes, blankets, and tents for soldiers. I was put in the manufacturing plant, assembling rifle ammunition and artillery shells. I would only work in the factory for 4 months due to my birthday. The day after my 18th birthday, my sister walked me down to the recruitment office to sign up for the Army. After signing the enlistment form, I was immediately loaded on a truck with other new recruits and shipped out. Year 1896, Third Era. It would take 3 days to reach our training camp, only stopping at military fuel dumps to fuel the trucks. Immediately as we got there, we were being yelled at to get off the trucks and get into a single file line. The officers told us to strip down to our undergarments. Then they covered us with a disinfectant powder that felt like it burnt my skin. After 10 minutes, we were sprayed down with a hose and given Army fatigues. The training would start the next day. We were pushed to our limits for 3 whole weeks running this training course. It was a miserable time. Then, for the last week, we went through rifle training. The rifle was a bolt-action spring rifle, being able to load 4 rounds of 30 to 6 cartridges at a time. The bayonet training was the easiest course. It wouldn't be long before we were graduating, but no ceremony, just given our rifle and loaded into the trucks and sent to the front line. As we were loaded onto the trucks, the officers told us what Army group we were supposed to join as we reached the battlefront, getting signed to the 10th Army Group. I counted 15 trucks being packed full with new soldiers. As I got into the back of one of the trucks, a man froze up, telling the officer he couldn't do it. But the officer just hit him in the stomach with the butt of his rifle and pushed him onto the truck, then lifted the tailgate, locking it. There was 20 of us in the back of this truck. We would end up talking basically the whole way there, finding out we had an officer in the back with us, and he told us the drive would be 122 miles before we hit the front. When we hit the 22-mile mark, we stopped talking. The sound of bombs exploding and gunfire that killed the mood. The truck stopped 10 miles from the front. We had to get out and march the rest of the way. All 300 of us walked towards the gunfire, but by tomorrow we would have to fight. Reaching the front early in the morning, there was a thick fog coating the entire battlefield. The smell of decomposing bodies and sulfur filled the air. As we came into the headquarters of the 10th Army Group, we reported to the commander. The commander informed us that the war has turned into a stalemate that has bogged down into a bloody trench warfare. The commander showed us a map of the area that had the trenches mapped out, pointing at the position we were reinforcing. We proceeded to head into the trenches, making our way to the section we were assigned. The trenches went from the Blue Sea coast all the way up to the border of Helsingør, Helsingør being a neutral nation, meaning Frankford or Bavarian couldn't cut through without breaking international law. Each Army group had a mapped-out section of the battlefield they were responsible for holding, and Army Groups 10, 6, and 3 had to hold Section D, so all 300 of us headed to Section D. Moving through the trenches was tough. It was muddy and wet, having to walk on wooden planks just to stay out of the mud. Also, it was rat-infested. Halfway to our position, we heard loud booms in the distance, then voices yelling out, "Everyone get down!" Explosions erupted all around, as throwing dirt, wood, and rocks everywhere. Being in the middle of an artillery bombardment was scary, probably the most scared I've been in my entire life. Explosions went on forever that felt like hours. It would suddenly stop. Then the screams of the injured filled the air. Before we checked if any of us were okay, officers started yelling. The enemy was coming. Then rifle fire began, and we all started to run through the trenches, getting into the battle. We reached the front trench line. As the shadows of the enemy appeared through the fog, we started firing our rifles, round after round, firing my rifle, shooting at shadows. We watched as the shadows fell down as we shot. Then 3 men with this massive gun pushed me aside to setting up. This massive gun, one began to fire the weapon as one fed a belt of rounds into the gun, and the third guy ran to get ammunition for the gun. I would learn fast that the weapon was called a machine gun. I continued to fight, and the man beside me firing his rifle would fall down at my feet. Looking down, he was dead, with a shot to the head. The battle lasted the whole day, ending at sunset. By the end of it, I was shaking in fear, looking around, and 10 of the men I came with were dead around me. The night came, and I sat in the trench, looking out at the zone they called No Man's Land. And it was creepy. Eventually, my eyes would close. When I opened them, it was the next day. All I could see in front of me was thousands of dead enemy soldiers laying all over No Man's Land. Winter of 1896, Third Era. I had been on the front for 3 months. By the time I received my first letter from my mother, it was not a good letter. My mother told me my brother Gregoire and my father was killed in the same battle 2 months ago. At the time, I didn't know what to think. Just sadness. The cold creeped up on us. None of us were ready for it. Water and mud started to freeze in the trenches. It was a brutally cold winter. We weren't given any winter clothing for the first month of winter. Hundreds of us would die due to the frigid temperatures, stripping clothing off of our dead comrades just to stay warm. We were only able to have a fire during the day, because at night we became targets for snipers hiding in No Man's Land, picking us off from a distance. The winter was mainly quiet beside the constant artillery shelling and the snipers. Spring of 1897, Third Era. Before the frozen ground defrosted, the 10th Army Group was being rounded up for an assault on the bombed-out city of Santienne that sat in the middle of No Man's Land. Over the winter, Bavarian soldiers began to occupy the city, and our generals wanted the city back. We all made our way to the jump-off point, walking through the trenches. As we got there, the artillery bombardment of the city began. Buildings that still stood started to crumble to the ground as the artillery shells exploded. The bombardment lasted 3 hours, 15 minutes before the artillery shells would stop. Our officers started yelling, "As I blow this whistle, everyone up and out. Keep running until you reach the city. Don't worry about your fellow man beside you. If you stop, you are dead. If you don't go over, I'll shoot you myself. So everyone fix bayonets." Shortly after the officers stopped talking, then he blew the whistle. As we got out of the trenches, the bombardment ended. I started running. With every step, I could hear my heart pounding. Looking at the city, I could see muzzle flashes coming from the cities, rubble and windows that still stood. I watched my fellow soldiers fall in front of me. One of them got hit, twisting him around, and I saw his chest ripped open. I reached a half-destroyed wall on the outskirts of the city. Only 6 others made it to me at that time. We could hear Bavarian soldiers talking and firing their rifles on the other side. We prepared to pop out from the wall to shoot them. We counted to 5. Then we jumped out. Their faces had the look of surprise on them. Then we fired our rifles, killing most of them before some could get into cover. We got behind the wall again as we started taking rifle fire. We got pinned down. A lot more of our men finally reached us. 3 of them pulled out grenades. Then they threw them so perfectly, the grenades landed basically right on top of them. You could hear them screaming in their language. Then the grenades went off. Then we started to hear the enemy moaning in pain. We moved in. As we came around the corner, a Bavarian soldier shot, hitting one of our men straight in the chest, dropping him. We opened fire, killing the Bavarian. We checked the dead, but one was still alive, laying on the ground with his legs mangled with shrapnel. We made eye contact. He spoke to me, but I couldn't understand what he was saying. I quietly responded with, "I'm sorry," as I stabbed him in his heart with my bayonet. We would hold down our position till more reinforcements were able to back us up. Waiting there, I found a Bavarian sidearm and 4 boxes of ammunition. The pistol was the property of the man I had bayoneted. It was a gun I've never seen. The pistol had to be loaded from the top, using a clip with 10 9mm rounds that had to be fed into the gun by pushing down on the rounds. Then removing the clip, I would attach the pistol holster to my side, claiming the gun for myself. It wouldn't be long before we had 30 men and was ready to make our push further into the city. We started making our way through the destroyed city's streets. It seemed like every building was occupied by the enemy. We fought with everything we had. I watched many of my comrades fall in the heat of battle. Then a back blast of an explosion threw me. My head was ringing as I collected my thoughts and stumbled back to my feet, picking my rifle up off the ground. As a Bavarian soldier came around the corner of the building I was behind, he started to aim his rifle at me. Then I saw him get shot in the head as a comrade passed me saying, "You can thank me later." I finally fully came back to my senses and then got back into the fight. I fired all 104 rounds of my ammunition. By the end of the day, we would stop our advance into the city when the sun went down. That night, we were resupplied with ammunition and grenades. The whole night, I couldn't sleep. Every 5 minutes, rifle fire rang out through the city. The morning came and we moved further into the city. But things were different. It was weirdly quiet. Just yesterday, you could hear explosions, rifle and machine gun fire filling the air in the city's streets. It looked like the enemy dropped everything and pulled out of the city. Walking through the city, we reached the river that cuts through the center of the city, only being connected by 4 bridges. As we gathered on the bank of the river, then all hell broke loose. The enemy had set up on the other side of the river and waited for us to move into a trap. Machine guns tore through our ranks, killing at least 100 of us. Then the loud booms began from afar. Artillery rounds began to fall down on us, hearing officers scream out, "Retreat," and fall back. We all started to run back through the city streets, trying not to trip over rubble, artillery shells exploding all around us. As we made our way out, I made it back to the trenches, but it wasn't over yet. The trenches took a heavy artillery bombardment. It would stop midday. Then we heard yelling. Before I could pick my head up, our machine guns began to fire. The same man that saved my life back in the city ran over to me, telling me the fight isn't over yet. They're attacking our lines. I stood up, swinging my rifle, firing directly at the enemy, pulling the trigger. We fought for the rest of the day, and by the end of it, I was completely drained of energy. Summer of 1897, Third Era. The 10th Army Group had to be removed from the battle. We suffered 40,000 casualties out of 60,000 troops during the battle. That's not even counting the 13th and 20th Army Groups. The battle would last a week longer after we were off of the battlefield. Eventually, our generals would just give up the battle, making all of them deaths meaningless. We were moved back 10 miles from the front trench line, giving the 10th Army Group 3 weeks of rest as we received more troops to bring our fighting force back to full strength. I found it hard to adjust. Every time I closed my eyes, I would see the man I stabbed with my bayonet at Santienne. We would only receive 32,000 soldiers by the time we were being moved back to the front. As we moved through the trenches, a couple of us would stop to watch 4 of our soldiers tied to poles with blindfolds on, as 8 others and an officer would execute them by firing squad. Our officer pushed us, telling us to keep on moving, saying they were deserters and that deserters will be shot without a trial. So keep it moving. When we got back to the front trenches, we were greeted with an officer passing out gas masks to every single soldier, showing us how to put it on and explaining the Bavaria had started to use poisonous gas, but they only had 14,000 masks to go around. We moved back into our old positions, trying to get comfortable. 5 days later, I would receive another letter, but it wasn't from my mother, but my sister. First thing it said was my mother was really sick. My oldest brother, Raphael, was back home, but was a casualty of an accident of a faulty artillery shell that exploded next to him, taking off both of his legs. The city of Nantes was in a bad situation. Food was getting scarce in the city. The army started to conscript boys 16 and older into the military. Autumn of 1897, Third Era. Our generals wanted one more massive offensive advancement before winter swept over the land. Both of our armies started adopting the newly invented airplane, using them to fly over our trenches, to gather information, to plan better strategical battles. The generals saw a less defended part of the Bavarian trench line, which was 15 miles down from our position, so we were automatically nominated to take part in the push. 500,000 men were assembled for the offensive. For 7 days, the enemy trenches was bombarded non-stop. Over 10,000 artillery shells were used before we went over the top into no man's land. We stood there waiting in our trenches for the officers to blow the whistles. It felt like forever. Then the whiny sound of the whistles blew. We all got out of the trenches and started to run towards the enemy lines. Before the enemy could get back into a defensive position, we were already on top of them, jumping into their trenches, partaking in close quarters combat, using bayonets, knives, shovels, and the butts of our rifles, anything we could get our hands on, we used to kill the enemy with. The enemy trenches were lined with concrete and had bunkers deep underground, making it very difficult to root out the Bavarians. We kept on fighting. I got into a hand-to-hand fight with this Bavarian soldier. We struggled to get the upper hand on each other. Eventually, I was able to get my sidearm out. As I pulled it up, he stabbed me in my left shoulder. Having my pistol in my right hand, I put the barrel to his stomach, pulling the trigger until the gun ran out of ammunition. I sat down and reloaded my pistol as chaos erupted all around me. After I had the gun loaded, I started to look at my shoulder. I pulled the blade out and packed the wound with my handkerchief. Then I ripped my left sleeve off my uniform, using it to wrap my shoulder up the best I could. I stood up and began to get back into the battle. Not being able to use my left arm made it very difficult to continue fighting, but I powered through the pain. By the time we began thinking we had won the battle, the sound of engines started to approach. Then the loud booms began. It sounded like thousands of grenades were going off, all at the same time. But it wasn't grenades. The Bavarians took their trucks, equipping them with thick sheets of steel on the front, back, and the sides, making them almost bulletproof. They also attached a new heavy machine gun onto it. I watched these trucks open fire on us and their own men. The machine guns were so powerful, heads turned to mist, ripping and tearing limbs off with every round. Nobody had to say anything. We all started getting out of the trenches, running back to our lines. As I was running, I felt like something hit me in the back of the head. I fell into a muddy crater in no man's land. I tried to get up, but I would pass out. When I awoke, it was dark, and I had a massive headache. I picked up my helmet. I looked at it, and there was a piece missing out of the top. I felt my head, realizing that I had a deep cut on my head that was bleeding a lot. I was in a really bad situation. I was bleeding from my head and shoulder. I slowly peeked my head out of the crater, looking around. I was so close to the Bavarian trench, I could hear them talking and laughing. I started to crawl out of the crater, moving towards the friendly line. It was wet and muddy. Crawling over destroyed trees, avoiding barbed wire, and finding bodies of my fellow comrades. Pain was excruciating. Every time I moved, it felt like I was being stabbed in my shoulder over and over again. As I dragged myself closer to the trenches, I started to hear friendly voices, eventually making it to the trench, pulling myself into it, hitting the trench floor. I started hearing voices say, "Is it the enemy? No, it's one of ours." Then another voice spoke. "It's Eugène. Get him to a field hospital." As everything went dark, I woke up in a military hospital, hundreds of miles away from the trenches. I was dazed and confused, trying to figure out what had happened. As a nurse walked into my room, I asked her if she knew what was going on. She spoke in a soothing voice. "You were brought to the hospital a couple of years ago, and you have been in a coma. We tried to save your left arm. I'm very sorry, Eugène, but there was too much damage to the nerves, and you will not be able to move it." I told her I didn't care about myself. I wanted to know what was going on with the war. She would just walk out of the room. I would find out a month later. It was the spring of 1901, Third Era. Bavarian and Frankfurt kept fighting battles without accomplishing anything, sending over 6 million people to their deaths. After the leader of Bavaria was assassinated, his son took power of the nation, then wanted a peaceful outcome to the war. Frankfurt wanted all the territory that had been seized by the Bavarians. But the leader of Bavaria, Adolf Kaiser, would deny the proposition. Eventually, both nations cited a ceasefire declaration, and then they both began to build their armies up again. I would be released from the hospital 6 months after the ceasefire was openly announced to the nation. I was discharged from the army as well. It took me a week to get to Nantes to see my mother, but when I got there, I found out my mother had passed away from her sickness. My youngest brother was conscripted into the army. Seeing my oldest brother without his legs, I told my sister and brother that I was going to move them to Brooklyn. That was across the Green Sea. Away from any future fighting, they didn't argue with me. A week later, both of them were on a ship heading to Brooklyn. A month later, my sister sent me a letter from Brooklyn, and she said she wasn't going to stay in the country, and they were getting on another ship that was headed to a country called the Union of Amere that was across the Arctic Ocean. She told me that she loved me and hoped I would come see her sometime, but I wasn't going anywhere. I still see the faces of the men I killed and friends I have made in the trenches. It is hard for me to sleep. I am sorry, my sister and brother, but this is a goodbye. Please take care of each other and live long lives.
If you guys made it to the end of the video here, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button and hit that notification button so you can see when my next stories will be uploaded. So, stay tuned for more videos.